Hi, my name's Mike Parker from Mining Footprint Limited. This is week 4 of our conversation surrounding how we look at mining through the lens of international relations theory. As usual, I'm joined by our international relations practitioner, Jake Erickson. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, Mike. It's a sunny day here in America.
Fantastic. So this week we're going to talk about constructivism. Now just tell us a few things about constructivism and how this might be applied to the mining world.
So in previous lecture series, we've talked a lot about sort of these rationalist theories that focus a lot on supply and demand or national interest or hard economic measures as a way of explaining why state or other actors behave the way they do. Now, constructivism is similar in that it accepts all these different actors as existing entities. It differs in the fact that it also believes human constructs play an equally important role in shaping the behavior of actors. So a key component to constructivism then is explaining behavior. Why is it that you might have a given community impacted by a mine project receiving numerous benefits from the mine project in the form of remittances or the building of a school or new waterworks projects and still be opposed to the mine? If you were to look at it from a rationalist perspective, that's something that a community would want. And yet somehow the community comes out in opposition to the project. So a constructivist would look at that behavior, in this case communal opposition, and attempt to analyze that behavior within a broader context of how that construct was first formed, how that opposition first came into being.
We're going to try and understand how, through human consciousness, there's a world that's constructed socially, and if we understand that construction, we can understand how that world and how those actors are then applied to the rational circumstance.
In other words, we're looking at industry perspectives in which tangible, measurable impacts are often the source of how we determine community relations. But it seems in the constructivist case that we're also talking about elements that might not be as visible and yet be equally impactful. So here we actually might be returning back to previous arguments we've made regarding mainstream megatrends in the mining industry, which I'm sure your industry experience can attest to, right?
In fact, we've done a short video on the mainstream megatrends, which we consider are the most important that do impact the mining industry. The 3 main focuses, there's environmental awareness, and in the last 40 to 30 years, the world has become much more environmentally aware, mostly due to a series of events and accidents, which has raised awareness as the world has become more transparent about environmental damage. There's then been the massive drive towards sustainability. The most recent focus, which is partly to do with sustainability, is climate change. And climate change has obviously got this massive focus on energy transition. And as we look today, especially in Latin America, many of the larger mines are moving towards renewable energy. As those sensitivities have become more and more pressing on all industries across the world, mining companies have had to introduce and incorporate those sensitivities and those mainstream megatrends into the narratives they use to support and promote their various projects.
These 3 mainstream megatrends are lived experiences that the world has formed a social construction or a construction of a viewpoint or a narrative that is focused around the sensibility to these 3 mainstream megatrends.
If we were to approach this from a constructivist perspective, the constructivists would point to all these different elements you referred to, right? Whether it be populism or poverty or climate, and they would really try to go to the root of what is it about these issues that is stoking behaviors of certain actors, whether it be government officials or political actors or populists or protesters or company executives. And it would point specifically to physical impacts that these people feel, in other words, lived experiences. a key part of how we frame our reality is done through the experiences that we live through. That's how we ultimately create information, right? And so the constructivists would take a following step and say that that reality is further shaped by our interactions with people around us. So why is it that when one person starts opposing a mine because of a very specific incident that they've had with the project, suddenly you have multiple different individuals around them identifying with the same issue, even though they might have never had a prior relationship with the project in question? And it has something to do with the narrative that all these different experiences that they've individually had share a common theme that unites them. Elites play a really important role in shaping these narratives, but so too do company executives that might not have any relation with the community. So a really key component here is identity. Whether or not you are for or against a project, whether or not you identify with or against a mine, is dictated by the experiences lived or narrated that you share with the people around you. And we call that intersubjectivity. You have an intersubjective view of the world. Information is not created in a closed environment. It's done in relation to others. So my response to you then would be, how can we apply identifying for or against a mine project with specific case studies, and maybe we can see these constructivist themes in action?
It's very true that mining companies are extremely sensitive in this modern world as to how they're viewed and as to how they're accepted in the country, in the region, and in the communities where they work. And there's a lot of talk around the phrase which is social license. And social license is basically the permission to operate in an area, and it's usually brought about by shared vision and showing that the communities and regions where you operate will get a lasting benefit from the construction, the operation, and even post-closure of a major mining project. Now that narrative is a very important part of any project. And I can think of a project in Peru called Antamina, which was built in 2001. And they had a very innovative approach how to build the mine in quite a complex area. And they were very, very successful in creating a very positive narrative. For instance, there is the fact that in the construction phase, there will be between 8,000 to 10,000 employees utilized, obviously creating a very positive aspect for employment. That during the operation of the mine, there'll be 1,400 permanent jobs. Overwhelmingly, the workforce was from Peru, and 100% of the non-skilled labor came from the local area, and that's 30% of the workforce. They created about 6,000 indirect jobs with the project. That would be service providers, transport people, various other industries that would be supplying to the mine. They increased Peruvian mining exports by an amazing 30%. And even more amazingly, in their first year of operation, the narrative they had said they would increase the whole country's GDP by 1.4%. But in doing this, they basically ensured that the local population was fully involved in both the community development programs and the environmental program. And obviously, by creating this very positive narrative, they've created a very positive social license, which they've managed to achieve and maintain, mostly unscathed, throughout the operation of the mine. Also, during the construction of the project, their consultation program was the most intensive ever undertaken in Peru with various actors, stakeholders, and obviously all of those consultations give them the ideal opportunity to create a very positive narrative about the project, which they very successfully did.
When the community is included in such a way that makes it clear to the community itself that not only are their voices being heard, but that ultimately the project's future rests on their identification with it, and vice versa, the benefits that it brings to the community, then you're able to have, under the constructivist sense, a construct in which the community identifies with the mine. So we often see these extreme examples in the industry where there's this really tense relationship between the local and this big international company or big conglomerate, when in reality it seems like what you're saying is that those relationships can be positive too, so long as they have the right priorities.
If we go back to Peru, there's an example of a project which does not have a positive relationship with its community. That project is called Tia Maria. It's in Arequipa province in the south of the country. And it's been mooted for more or less 10 years as a project that should be in development. The project is a copper mine. And initially, the project said they would use the water resources of the local area. And that caused consternation and worry amongst the local agricultural community, who basically saw that their livelihood may be at risk because of the use of this groundwater by the project. That initiated a set of conditions and a narrative which was negative against that project. The company then took a step back and came back to the community and said, okay, we'll take water from the ocean, which is quite close. We'll do a desalination plant and we'll use water from the ocean, and we won't touch any of the water resources in the area. However, the opposition still continued because the negative narrative had been set in place. And in that narrative, identity was very, very important. It was the identity of the local agricultural community of the Tambo Valley in Arequipa province, where the project would be. They created this narrative of themselves as a very culturally strong, very unified community that didn't need a mine. They were happy in their agricultural lifestyles and happy in the production and their culture as they've been doing for many, many decades now. Then they created another narrative which identified the company and said that the mine will then produce a whole series of contamination, which will impact the valley, which will impact negatively the agricultural activities and destroy some of the cultural heritage and some of the cultural legacies. The protests initially started during an election process in 2011 and have continued sporadically on and off in 3 or 4 year intervals since then. And that is basically an extremely negative narrative that's been created against a mining project in Peru.
I'd like to refer back to what you mentioned about narratives and the idea of a narrative being baked in and how difficult it is to remove negative perceptions once a community has identified against a given project. And I think a key component to how those narratives are created is through norms, right? If you have repeated patterns that people can refer to in their lived experiences, then it's much easier to create a narrative that's predicated on a negative or positive identity. We have to ask ourselves, well, how do you develop norms in the positive that can encourage communities to look at a project with an open mind before determining that previous incidents might be more prescient when they determine whether or not they're for or against the project?
In fact, in the 2 cases I've mentioned in Peru, the positive narrative was done ahead of time. It was done with a project that was not in existence but was going to be built. And that gave the company the opportunity to present a very positive, a very inclusive, a very environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable project, which was readily accepted by all. Whereas in the second case, the company made the error of trying to demonstrate it could use the existing groundwater, which raised resistance to the project, and then tried to change that perception afterwards, whereas unfortunately the existing narrative had already been put in place, and they became very disadvantaged by that and are still struggling to escape from that. And in this socially constructed world, the recognition as being an actor and your legitimacy as an actor in that world is based on your power, and your power is based mostly on ideas that you may have and narratives that you can put forward and communication and social construction, and not really material things that you may possess. A lot of the opponents to mining projects are not experts in environmental safety, are not expert sociologists or anthropologists, and yet they have the identity and civic identity which is sufficient for them to be associated with the project, to unify people, to collectively form groups which then talk a narrative.
Even with a little bit of hope, right? Even if you've had negative experiences with the project, doesn't mean that your future can't be a positive one with it, but it has to start with that initiative.
And from the perspective of mining footprint, our analysis of lived experiences is a very powerful tool to understand exactly how narratives may have formed in the past. And our application of international relations theories to look at mining through the lens of those theories is a very, very strong way of understanding how one can create narratives that would allay the fears of environmental damage or the fears of social disturbance and allow the project to sit most comfortably in the context where it is, and also how to avoid the creation of counter narratives which exploit lived experiences and exploit negative aspects of the mainstream megatrends that may be applied against the mining project.
So looking forward to next week's webinar, we'll be referring specifically to these human constructs within a more systemic infrastructure of post-colonial theories.
Thanks, Jake. And as you say, next week we'll be dealing with post-colonialism, which is an extremely interesting subject, and a subject that not many mining companies think about a lot, but one which is extremely important, especially in some of these developing economies. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to catching up with you next week.
Cheers, Mark.